There is a book that no longer exists. And I don't mean it's rare, or hard to find, or locked away in some private collection where only a handful of scholars ever get to see it. I mean it is gone, erased. No copy of it survives anywhere in the world. Not in a monastery, not in a museum, not in a sealed jar in a desert cave. If you searched every library on earth for the rest of your life, you would never find it, because the last complete copy of it crumbled into dust or burned or was simply, quietly, never copied again, somewhere back in the deep dark of antiquity. And yet, here is the strange part, the part that pulls you in and keeps you turning it over in the dark. We know it existed. We can quote from it. We can, in places, almost read it. Because even though the book itself is gone, little pieces of it got trapped, like insects in amber, inside other books that did survive. That's what tonight is about. A book you can only read through the cracks of other books. And it gets stranger, because the main place those pieces are hiding is not some ordinary text. The fragments of this lost book survive mostly inside another book, a book that was itself cut out of the Bible, a book that was, for most of Western history, considered forbidden, left out, marginalized, nearly erased in its own right, and only saved by an accident of geography kept alive in one corner of the world while the rest of the church let it go. So what you have is a ghost hiding inside an exile, a vanished scripture buried inside a banned one, a book within a book, and both of them, in their own way, lost. The banned book is called the Book of Enoch. We'll get to know it slowly, gently, tonight. But the ghost inside it, the erased scripture we're really chasing, has a name too. It's called the Book of Noah, attributed, the tradition says, to that same Noah, the one who built the ark, the one who, according to the story, was the single family chosen to survive when the whole world was washed away and started over. That Noah, it was believed, left behind a book of his own, and that book is the one that vanished. Now, I have to be honest with you right from the start, because this is a mystery and not a sermon, and the honesty is part of what makes it beautiful. We are not entirely sure this book ever existed as one single book. That's the real puzzle. Some scholars are convinced there was once a genuine, complete Book of Noah, a real scroll you could hold, and that we're finding its scattered limbs inside other texts. Other scholars think there may never have been one book at all, only a loose cloud of Noah stories floating around the ancient world that later writers reached into whenever they needed them. So part of what we're doing tonight is not just reading a lost book. It's asking whether the lost book was ever really there. We're chasing something, and we're not fully sure of its shape. That's not a flaw in the story, that is the story. Before we go any further, though, I want to do the thing I always do, because it's my favourite part. I want to know where you are right now, wherever you're lying in the dark with this playing softly. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what your local time is. I love reading them. It's one of the quiet wonders of doing this, seeing it come in from everywhere at once. Someone in Sao Paulo at midnight. Someone in Oslo where it's already tomorrow morning. Someone in a truck stop in Ohio at 3 a.m. who can't sleep. A whole planet, half of it dark, all of us awake in the same little pool of a story. Leave your city and your time, and in the morning, or whenever you drift back, you can scroll through and feel how many other people were lying awake in the dark with you, because that's really what these are for. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make them. There's no test at the end. You're allowed to drift off in the middle. If you only make it another 4 minutes before you're gone, that's a win. That's the whole point, and the story will still be here tomorrow. So let me tell you, softly, where we're going tonight, so you can settle in and let it carry you. We're going to follow a trail of clues into one of the strangest stories the ancient world ever told. It begins, of all places, with a baby, a newborn child so uncannily beautiful, so radiant, that his own father is not overjoyed but terrified, convinced the child cannot possibly be his. From that one frightened father, the story opens outward like a dark flower. We'll meet 200 angels who, the text says, looked down at the daughters of the earth and decided to come down. We'll meet what the story claims they fathered, giants, enormous and hungry, who devoured the world until it cried out. We'll hear about knowledge that was never meant to be handed to human beings, the making of swords, the secrets of the stars, the cutting of roots. We'll follow the great flood that was sent to wash it all clean, and then we'll discover, and this is the part that lingers with me, that the washing was not quite complete, that something invisible was left behind on the far side of the water, waiting for the survivors. And we'll follow Noah as he receives, the tradition says, a secret book of healing to protect his children from it. And underneath all of that, beneath the angels and the giants and the flood, we'll be doing something quieter, and, I think, even more haunting. We'll be watching a group of modern scholars in libraries and over photographs of 2,000-year-old scroll fragments, patiently trying to reassemble a book that someone, long ago, tried to make disappear, trying to fit the shards back together, trying to reconstruct a ghost. None of this, I want to be clear, is being told to you as fact. I'm not telling you that angels came down a mountain or that giants once walked the earth. These are ancient stories, apocryphal writings, contested scholarship, texts that most religious traditions set aside long ago. What we can say is that people wrote these things down and copied them and argued about them, and then some of them were quietly erased. Tonight we're reading the story as a story and reading the erasing as a mystery. What was in this book? Why did it survive only in the cracks? And why, when you follow those cracks all the way down, do you find something that looks less like a footnote and more like the missing source that everything else was quietly built on top of? So get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the light be low. There's nothing here that can hurt you. It's all very old and very far away, and we're only going to look at it gently from a safe distance, the way you'd look at something faintly glowing at the bottom of a very deep, very still well. Let's begin at the beginning by asking a simple question. How does a book vanish? Here's the thing we don't like to think about. Most books that have ever existed are gone. Not most of the bad ones, or most of the unimportant ones. Most books, full stop. If you could stand at the beginning of writing and watch it all roll forward, you would see far more books disappear than survive. The ones we still have are the lucky exceptions. They're the survivors of a shipwreck, and the ocean floor is covered with everything that didn't make it. And it's worth sitting for a moment in the dark with just how fragile the whole thing is. For most of history, a book was not printed. There was no press stamping out 10,000 identical copies. A book was a single object written out by hand, letter by letter, by one person bent over a table for weeks. Papyrus, the reed paper the ancient world wrote on, rots. It loves to rot. Leave it in anything damp, and within a few generations it's brown lace. Then it's nothing. Parchment, made from animal skin, lasts longer, but it burns just as well as anything else. And libraries burned all the time. Cities were sacked, storehouses flooded, and even when nothing dramatic happened at all, a book could die of pure neglect, of simply not being copied. Because a handwritten book only continues to exist if, every so often, before the old copy falls apart, somebody chooses to sit down and copy it out again. The moment people stop making that choice, the book is on a clock. When the last copy crumbles, that's it. The words are gone. Not hidden, gone. So most lost books are lost in the ordinary, total way. They vanish, and they take everything with them. We don't even know their names. There are titles we have that point to books nobody alive has ever read. There are quotations in surviving works that begin, as it is written in the book of, and then name a book that exists nowhere else on earth. Whole libraries of the ancient mind, and we're standing in the ashes. But, and this is where our mystery really lives, there is a stranger fate a book can suffer. A rarer one. A book can lose its own body, and yet not fully die. It can survive, not as itself, but as pieces of itself lodged inside other books that did manage to survive. Think about how that happens, because it's oddly natural. Imagine an ancient writer working on his own book, and he wants to make a point, so he reaches for an older, respected text and quotes a few lines of it. Just as I might quote a poem to you now, he copies a passage in. Then, somewhere else, he paraphrases a story from it, retells it in his own words. Elsewhere again, he just mentions it by name in passing, assuming you already know it, the way you'd mention a famous film without explaining the plot. Now, his book survives. It gets copied and recopied down the centuries. And the older book, the one he was quoting from, that one dies. Nobody keeps copying it. It rots away. But the pieces he lifted out of it are now riding along inside his book, protected, carried forward. A quotation here, a retold scene there, a bare mention somewhere else. The original is a ghost, and its ghost is walking around inside somebody else's living body. That is exactly the situation with the Book of Noah. It's not that we have a damaged copy of it with holes we're trying to fill. We have no copy of it at all. What we have are these embedded pieces, quotations, retellings and mentions scattered across several other ancient books that did survive. And when scholars line those pieces up next to each other, they start to notice that they rhyme, that they seem to be echoes of the same lost original. That's the whole game we'll be playing tonight, gathering the echoes and asking what they were echoes of. Now, to understand where these particular echoes live, you need to know one strange and lovely fact about how ancient religious books got their names, because it's central to everything and it's genuinely counterintuitive to us. In the ancient world, especially in the centuries around 2,000 years ago, there was a whole genre of sacred writing where the author's name on the book was not the person who actually wrote it. Books were written and then attributed to great heroes of the deep past. So you get a Book of Enoch, supposedly written by Enoch, a figure from the mists of Genesis who lived long before the flood. A Book of Noah, attributed to Noah. Books attributed to Abraham, to Moses, to the 12 sons of Jacob, to Adam himself. These were not usually forgeries in the sneaky, cynical sense we'd imagine. It was more like a tradition, a way of saying, this wisdom belongs to that ancient figure. This is the kind of thing he would have known. I am writing in his voice and under his authority. Scholars have a name for this whole class of writings. They call them pseudepigrapha, from the Greek, meaning, roughly, falsely attributed writings, books written under a borrowed ancient name. Enoch, Noah, the patriarchs, these were the great bylines of a lost literature. And here's why that matters so much for us. There were far, far more of these books than ever made it into any Bible. The Bible you might picture on a shelf, that fixed, closed collection, is the end of a long, slow human process of sorting, of choosing communities and their leaders. Over centuries, gradually decided which books were in and which were out, which ones would be read aloud in worship, copied faithfully protected, and which ones would be set aside, allowed to fade, quietly let go. That process of drawing the line, of building the fence around the approved books, is what people mean by the forming of a canon. A canon is not just a list of what's holy. It's also, unavoidably, a list of what got left outside in the cold. And this is the quiet, aching thing to hold on to as you drift tonight. A canon forms by inclusion and exclusion at the same time. Every book that's kept is standing on top of other books that were not. The ones that were left out didn't get the protection. They stopped being copied. They started their long slide toward the ocean floor. And some of them, the unluckiest or maybe the most dangerous, didn't even survive as excluded books. They survived only as fragments trapped inside the excluded books that happened to last a little longer. A fragment surviving inside a castaway, that's the Book of Noah's exact address. So now you can picture the work that lies ahead of the people chasing it. It's detective work, it really is. Imagine a detective standing in a house where a beautiful vase was smashed long ago and swept up carelessly, and the shards were scattered into different rooms. A few pieces here, under a bed. A few there, kicked behind a cupboard in another room entirely. A curved fragment out in the hall. No single room contains the vase. No room even contains a majority of it. But the detective goes from room to room, gathering shards, laying them out on a table, turning them, testing which curve fits which, and slowly out of pieces that were never meant to be found together, the shape of the vanished vase begins to rise up off the table. You can start to see it. You can see how tall it was, roughly where the handle went, the pattern that ran around its belly. You will never have the whole thing. There'll be gaps forever. But the shape returns. That's what we're going to watch scholars do with the Book of Noah. Gather the shards from different books, different caves, different languages, and coax the shape of a vanished thing up out of the fragments. And the first room they have to walk into, the room where the most and the strangest shards are hiding, is that forbidden book we mentioned. The one that was itself cut out and cast aside, and only survived by slipping out the back door of history into a single faraway country. The Book of Enoch. Let's go inside it. Here we are then, inside it. Scholars often call it 1 Enoch, with a number in front, and there's a reason for the number that tells you something about it right away. There is more than one book carrying Enoch's name, and this is the first and oldest of them. But let's not get tangled in the numbering. Tonight it's just the Book of Enoch, and the first thing to understand about it is who it claims to be from. Enoch. He's a small, haunting figure tucked into the early chapters of Genesis, in that long list of the generations before the flood, the fathers and sons stretching back toward the beginning of the world, each one living for centuries. And in that list, everyone follows the same pattern. So-and-so lived so many years, and had sons and daughters, and then he died. Died. The word tolls down the whole family tree like a bell. Except for one man. Enoch, of Enoch. The text says something different, something strange and quiet that has fascinated readers for thousands of years. It says he walked with God, and then it says, and he was not, for God took him. He doesn't die, he's just taken, gone, walked off the edge of the ordinary world with God, and didn't come back. 4 generations before the flood, one man simply steps out of the story of death. You can see why a figure like that became a magnet. A man who didn't die, who walked with God, who was taken up. Where did he go? What did he see? What did he learn up there, among whatever there is above the sky? And so, in the centuries before and around 2,000 years ago, an entire literature grew up in Enoch's name, claiming to tell you exactly that. Claiming to be the record of what Enoch saw when he was taken, journeys through the heavens, the secret machinery of the stars and the seasons, the places where the spirits of the dead wait, and, at the very front of it, the story of how the world went so wrong that it had to be drowned. That collection is the Book of Enoch, and it's composite. It wasn't written all at once by one hand. It's more like an anthology that grew in layers over a long stretch of time, its oldest parts reaching back centuries before the Common Era. A book assembled out of books. Keep that in the back of your mind. A book assembled out of books, because it's going to matter enormously in a moment. Now, for all that richness, the Book of Enoch was, over the long centuries, pushed out. It did not make it into the standard Jewish scriptures. It did not make it into the Bible of most of the Christian world by around the 4th century of the Common Era, As the great churches were settling their canons, drawing those fences we talked about, Enoch found itself on the outside, set aside, no longer read as scripture, no longer in most places copied and protected. And you know now what that sentence means for an ancient book. It means the clock starts. It means the long slide toward the ocean floor. And this is where the Book of Enoch's survival becomes almost miraculous, one of those accidents of history that when you really sit with it, gives you a small chill of wonder in the dark. Because while the book was dying everywhere else, fading out of the Greek world, out of the Latin world, out of the memory of the churches that had once known it, it stayed alive, complete, in one place. In Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, tucked away in the highlands of East Africa, never let it go. They kept it as scripture. They went on copying it faithfully, generation after generation, in their own ancient liturgical language called Ge'ez, classical Ethiopic. And so for centuries there was this strange situation where scholars in Europe knew the Book of Enoch had once existed, from old mentions of it, but had no copy. It was to them a lost book, while all along the full text was sitting on the shelves of Ethiopian churches being read and treasured in a language most of Europe didn't know. The only complete Book of Enoch that survives anywhere in the world survives in Ge'ez, saved by the Ethiopian and Eritrean churches. Everywhere else it had become a ghost. In one place it stayed a living book. And then the ground gave up a second witness. In the middle of the 20th century, in caves above the Dead Sea, came the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, thousands of fragments of ancient manuscripts, hidden away roughly 2,000 years ago, and sealed in the dry desert dark all that time. And among them, in fragments, in the original Aramaic, were pieces of the Book of Enoch. This mattered more than you might think, because a skeptic could always have said, how do we know this Ethiopic book is really ancient? How do we know it wasn't written much later? But there in the scrolls were scraps of Enoch in an old Semitic tongue, physically 2,000 years old, proving the book's deep antiquity beyond any doubt. The Enoch the Ethiopians had been quietly guarding was old, genuinely, breathtakingly old. And there's one more thread I want to give you, because it shows how differently this book was once regarded. There was a time when the Book of Enoch was not on the outside at all, when it was respected, even quoted as authority. And the proof of that is sitting, of all places, inside the New Testament. In one of its very short letters, the little epistle of Jude, near the very end of the Christian Bible, the author quotes a prophecy, and the prophecy he quotes is from the Book of Enoch. He names Enoch and repeats his words in verses 14 and 15, as though it's perfectly natural to do so, as though his readers would know exactly what he meant. A book that would later be cast out was, at that early moment, being cited inside a book that would be kept. The exile and the scripture, side by side, before the fences went up. So that's our container. A book attributed to a man who never died, composite, ancient, cast out by the 4th century, saved whole only in the highlands of Ethiopia in the Ge'ez tongue, confirmed as genuinely old by Aramaic fragments in the desert, and once respected enough to be quoted in the New Testament itself. Already it's a remarkable object. Already you could fall asleep on the strangeness of it. But we are not here for the container. We are here for what's hidden inside it. And this is the twist that turns a strange old book into a genuine mystery. Remember I said, twice now, to keep in mind that the Book of Enoch is a book assembled out of books. Here's why. When scholars read closely through the Book of Enoch, when they really live inside its sentences the way a detective lives inside a crime scene, they start to notice seams, places where the fabric doesn't quite match itself. There's a section near the very front, the great story of how the world went wrong, the coming down of the angels, the giants, the ruin of the earth. And in that whole long central terrible passage, something is off. Enoch is barely there. This is supposed to be Enoch's book, his vision, his testimony. and yet through these chapters he all but vanishes from his own story. The passage doesn't seem to care about Enoch. What it cares about, who it keeps circling back toward, whose survival and whose rescue it's really building toward, is the flood. And the man of the flood is not Enoch, it's Noah. Do you feel the strangeness of that? You're deep inside the Book of Enoch, and suddenly, for a stretch, it stops sounding like a book about Enoch and starts sounding like a book about Noah, as if a piece of some other text, an older, separate book, one that was really about Noah and the flood, had been picked up and sewn into the middle of Enoch's book, stitched in, the seams left faintly showing. And it's not only that passage. Toward the very end of the Book of Enoch, there's another stretch, the story of a miraculous, glowing child being born that has the same quality. It reads like it wandered in from somewhere else. It's about Noah again. It fits awkwardly. It has that same feeling of a patch sewn onto a different garment. This is the clue that started the hunt. This is what makes serious scholars stop and lean in. Because if you have a forbidden book, and inside that forbidden book you keep finding passages that forget their own supposed author and talk instead about a different man entirely, passages that feel imported, stitched in, older than their surroundings, then the natural question becomes almost unbearable. What if those seams are the edges of another book, an even older one, a book that was really about Noah, that once stood on its own, and that got taken apart and sewn, piece by piece, into the body of Enoch, and then vanished as its own book, leaving only the stitches behind? That book, that's the ghost we've come looking for. And the first place its shape rises up off the table is in the story of a newborn child glowing in the dark, and the father who was afraid of him. So picture the scene, the way the text paints it. It's a long time ago, deep in the world before the flood, and a child is being born. An ordinary night in an ordinary house, to a man named Lamech. And Lamech is not a stranger to us. If you follow the genealogies in Genesis, he's part of that long chain of impossibly old names, fathers and sons stretching back toward the beginning. He's the son of Methuselah, the man famous for living longer than anyone else in the Bible. And Methuselah, in turn, is the son of Enoch, the one who walked with God and was taken. So this baby on this night is being born into one of the strangest families in all of Scripture. A great-grandfather who lives among the angels. A grandfather who will outlast nearly everything. And now a newborn. And here's where the story stops being ordinary. Because according to this passage, 1 Enoch, chapters 106 and 107, the very passage that so many scholars think is a surviving splinter of that lost Book of Noah, this is no normal child. The text describes him almost the way you'd describe a small fire. His body, it says, is white like snow, and at the same time red, like a rose. His hair, and this is a newborn, remember, his hair is white as wool, long and white, the way you'd imagine on someone impossibly ancient, not someone minutes old. And then comes the detail that everyone remembers, the one that gives the whole scene its glow. When the baby opens his eyes, the text says the eyes light up the entire house. The whole room fills with light, as if the sun itself had risen indoors. A midwife holding a lamp would have had no need for the lamp. The child is his own light. Now, sit with that image for a second, the way you might if you were lying there in the dark right now. A newborn, pale as snow and flushed like a rose, crowned with an old man's white hair, and eyes that pour light into every corner of the room. It's a beautiful image, in a way, uncanny, but beautiful. If you'd never heard this story before, you might expect what comes next to be joy, wonder, a father falling to his knees overwhelmed, holding a miracle. But that's not what happens, and that's the first place the story turns cold. Because the father, Lamech, is not overjoyed. He is afraid. The text is very clear about this. He takes one look at this radiant child, and something in him recoils. He doesn't see a blessing, he sees a problem. He sees, if we're honest about the language, a threat, something that shouldn't be, something that doesn't belong in his house, in his family, under his own roof. His first instinct isn't to celebrate, it's to suspect. And I think that's the detail that makes this passage so quietly haunting. Every instinct we have as modern readers is pointed the wrong way. We see a glowing baby and we think, chosen one, special, marked for something wonderful. Lamech sees the exact same thing, and his blood runs cold. Which tells you that in the world this story comes from, a radiant, uncanny child did not mean what we'd assume. It meant something specific, and something frightening. Now, to feel why, you have to understand something about the world these ancient listeners carried in their heads, and we're going to spend real time on it, because it's the whole engine of the mystery. But even here, in this birth scene, you can feel the pressure of it. Lamech looks at his son, and immediately his mind goes somewhere terrible. He starts to wonder whether the child is even his at all. He starts to wonder whether something else, someone else, something not human, had a hand in this. The glow isn't just strange to him. To him, the glow is evidence. Evidence of what we'll get to. Hold that thread, because the fear itself is the clue. And here's a small thing worth noticing, the kind of thing scholars love, the kind of thing that makes this feel less like an isolated fairy tale and more like a thread woven through a much bigger tapestry. That image, the shining eyes, the being who lights up a space with an unearthly radiance, it doesn't appear only here. There's a moment much later in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Daniel, chapter 10, where Daniel describes seeing a figure by a great river. And the way he describes this figure is startling, if you've just been reading about baby Noah. The figure's face is like lightning, his arms and feet gleam like polished bronze, and his eyes are like flaming torches, like burning lamps. You catch that? The same instinct reaching for the same picture. Eyes that are not eyes but lights, a body that seems to be lit from within. In Daniel, that figure is clearly something more than human, an angel, a heavenly messenger, a being from the other side of the veil. And here in the birth of Noah, the newborn is described with that very same shimmer, the same visual vocabulary, as if whoever wrote this story reached into the same box of images that gets used for angels and pulled out that light and draped it over a baby lying in his father's house. Now, scholars are careful here, and so should we be. Nobody is saying one text is quoting the other, or that these two passages are directly linked in some provable chain. What they notice is subtler, and honestly more interesting. They notice that across this whole body of ancient literature, there's a shared visual language for the divine, a grammar of the uncanny, when something belongs to heaven, when something has crossed over from the other realm, it glows, it shines, its eyes burn, and so when you meet a newborn baby who lights up the room like the sun, the ancient listener doesn't need it spelled out. They already know what that light usually means. It means not entirely of this world, and that is exactly, precisely, why Lamech is afraid. Think about how carefully constructed that is, even as a piece of storytelling. The writer doesn't have to explain Lamech's terror. He just has to describe the light, because the audience already carries the fear. They've heard in the stories they grew up on about beings who came down from the sky and did not stay in their proper place. They know that the boundary between the human world and the heavenly world was not, in the deep past, as sealed as we might like to think. So a child who shines, a child who looks like he was lit by whatever lit those beings, is not a miracle to them. He is a question, a frightening question with a frightening possible answer. And the whole rest of this ancient story, in a sense, is Lamech trying to get that question answered, trying to find out what exactly walked into his house on the night this glowing child was born. Whether the light in those little eyes is a blessing or a curse. whether this is his son or something that only looks like his son. So we have our opening image, and it's a strange and lovely and slightly chilling one. A tiny body, snow white and rose red, an old man's white hair on a newborn head, and two eyes that open and flood the whole dark house with light. A midwife, maybe, stepping back. A mother, exhausted, watching her husband's face. And on that husband's face, not the wonder you'd expect, but dread. Cold, rising, specific dread. To understand that dread, we have to go where Lamech's own mind went. We have to follow his suspicion, because he does not keep it to himself. In another ancient version of this very night, preserved remarkably, on a scroll pulled out of a cave by the Dead Sea, Lamech turns to the one person who might know the truth. He turns to his wife, and he asks her a question that no husband ever wants to have to ask. To really understand what Lamech is afraid of, you have to name it. And the name is one you may have half heard before, floating around the edges of the strangest 4 verses in the Bible. The word is Nephilim. The idea is the offspring, the children of beings the ancient texts call the Watchers. We're going to spend proper time with the Watchers later, because they're the dark heart of this whole story. But for now, all you need is the shape of the fear, the thing that made Lamech's stomach drop when he saw his sun shining in the dark. In the world these stories come from, it was believed, or at least it was told, that a group of heavenly beings, angels of a kind, had once come down out of the sky, that they had looked at human women and desired them, and that they had crossed a line that was never ever supposed to be crossed. They took wives. They had children, and those children were not human, not fully. They were something in between, something that carried a spark of the heavenly in a body of flesh, and that spark could show. It could shine. So now put yourself back in that room. Lamech is looking at a baby who glows like a coal, whose eyes fill the house with light, whose hair is white as wool on a head only minutes old. And the one explanation his culture hands him, the ready-made terrible explanation, is that this is one of those children, that while he was away or without his knowing, one of those sky beings had come to his wife, that the light in the baby's eyes is not a blessing from God, but a stain from heaven's rebels, that the child in the cradle is a Nephilim, not his son at all, but the son of a fallen angel. That's the fear. And I want you to notice how intimate it is, how human, underneath all the cosmic strangeness. Strip away the angels and the glowing eyes, and what you have is one of the oldest and most painful suspicions a person can carry. A husband looking at a newborn and wondering in the pit of his chest whether the child is really his. It's a suspicion that has broken ordinary families in every century since. And here it is, at the very dawn of the world, dressed in the language of angels and light. The suspicion is monstrous in scale, but achingly familiar in kind. And I think that's part of why this story has never quite let go of people. Now here's where it gets remarkable, and where the detective side of this whole thing lights up again. Because we don't only have this scene in the Book of Enoch. There's another ancient version of this exact night, and it was found in one of the most famous discoveries of the last century, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the caves near Qumran. The scroll scholars label 1Q20, usually called the Genesis Apocryphon, an Aramaic manuscript, brittle and damaged, that retells the stories of Genesis in a richer, more personal voice, filling in the silences, giving the old figures thoughts and feelings and dialogue the Bible never gave them. And in the Genesis Apocryphon, we get Lamech telling this story in his own voice. First person. I, Lamech. You can feel him confiding in you across all those thousands of years. And what he confides is exactly this dread. He looks at the child. His heart is troubled, and he cannot keep the fear inside. So he goes to his wife, and here, wonderfully, she has a name. In this scroll she is called Beatenosh, sometimes written Beitenosh. a name the canonical Bible never bothered to record, surviving only here, on this one damaged scroll in the desert. And Lamech confronts her. He asks her, you can imagine the pain in it, to tell him the truth, to swear to him that this child is his, that she has not been with one of the watchers, one of the beings from the sky, that the glow in the baby's eyes came from him, from Lamech, and from no one and nothing else. And Bitternosh answers him. And her answer is one of the most quietly extraordinary things in this whole body of ancient literature, because it is so human. She doesn't dissolve into tears or beg, she meets him. She swears an oath, she reminds him, with real feeling, of their own intimacy, of the night this child was conceived, of the closeness they shared, of the pleasure of it, and she stakes the truth on that shared memory. She essentially says, you were there, you know. This child came from that night, from us, from you. There was no one else. There was nothing else. She swears it by the most intimate thing they have. It's such a startling scene to find on an ancient scroll. Not a lecture, not a genealogy, not a list of who begat whom. A marriage, in a tense and frightened moment, one partner accusing and the other defending her own body and her own faithfulness, staking her honour on a memory only the two of them share. It's the kind of scene you'd expect in a novel, not in a 2,000-year-old fragment pulled from a cave. And it survives, against all odds, when the whole book it belonged to did not. But step back from the tenderness of it, and look at what the scene assumes. Look at the worldview it takes completely for granted. Because for Lamech's fear to even make sense, for the accusation to be a reasonable thing to think rather than a madness, the people telling this story had to live inside a certain picture of reality. A picture in which the wall between the human world and the divine world had a door in it, in which it was genuinely possible, not just as metaphor, but as a thing that could happen to your own wife in your own house, for a being from the sky to father a child on the earth, in which a woman's baby might not belong entirely to this world at all, might belong in part to heaven, or to whatever had fallen out of it. That's the deep strangeness underneath the whole tale, not the glowing eyes. The eyes are just the symptom. The real strangeness is a world in which the boundary between human and divine had been broken open, and everyone knew it, and a new father could look at his own son and seriously, sincerely wonder which side of that boundary the child had come from. We live inside sealed categories. Human is human, and the divine, if it's anywhere, is somewhere far off and separate. These stories come from people who did not feel that seal at all. For them, the border was porous and recent and dangerous, and the evidence of its breach might be lying right there in the cradle, filling the room with light. So Bitternosh swears her oath, and you'd think that would settle it. Her word, her memory, her honour, surely that's enough. But here's the thing about a fear like Lamech's. It's not really about evidence. It's about a dread that has sunk in too deep to be argued away by a single conversation, however loving. He hears her oath, and some part of him wants to believe it. Of course he does. But he cannot fully quiet the thing that woke in him when those little eyes opened, and the darkness fled the room. The suspicion has its hooks in him. He needs more than his wife's word. He needs to know with certainty what has happened, and what this child is, and what it means. And so, unsettled, unable to rest, unable to simply hold his son and be a father, Lamech goes looking for an answer bigger than any that his own household can give him. He leaves. He goes to the one man in his family who might have wisdom old enough and deep enough to see the truth of it. He goes to his father, he goes to Methuselah, but here's the quiet problem with going to Methuselah. Methuselah doesn't know either. He listens to his son. He hears about the glowing child, the white hair, the eyes that fill the house with light, the oath Bitternosh swore. And this old, old man, the longest-lived figure in all of Scripture, a man whose very name has become a byword for age, this man looks at the mystery his son has brought him, and he cannot answer it. It's too strange. It's too far outside even his long experience. And so he does something extraordinary, something that tells you just how deep the fear runs in this family. He decides he has to ask someone with knowledge older than his own. He decides to go and find his own father, and his own father is Enoch. Take a breath and feel how strange that is, because Enoch, remember, is the one who was taken. In Genesis, his story ends with that haunting little line that he walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. He doesn't die like the others in that long list of names. He simply at some point stops being among the living and passes over to somewhere else. And in this tradition, that somewhere else is very specific. Enoch dwells among the angels. He lives now at the edges of the created world in the company of the very heavenly beings this whole story revolves around. He is a human who went to live in heaven and never came back. So look at what this family tree actually is. 4 generations standing in a line across the strangest threshold imaginable. Enoch, who lives among the angels. His son Methuselah, still on the earth, impossibly old. Methuselah's son Lamech, frightened, holding a question he can't answer. And Lamech's son, the newborn glowing in his cradle, the reason for all of it. 4 generations, and one of them is in heaven. It's a family with a door in it. A family where, if you have a question too big for the world, you can, apparently, go and knock on the edge of the sky and ask. And that's what Methuselah does. The text says he journeys to the ends of the earth. Sit with that phrase for a moment, because it's beautiful and it's meant to be. Not to the next village, not to a wise man in the next valley, to the ends of the earth, to the far horizon where, in the imagination of these ancient people, the flat world ran out and the realm of heaven began. Methuselah, an old man, sets out to walk to the very rim of everything, to the place where the human world touches the other one, because that is the only place left where his father can be found. It's one of the loveliest images in the whole story, if you let it settle. A son going to the ends of the earth to ask his father a question about a grandchild. Just family, stretched across the boundary of worlds. And he finds him, somehow out there at the edge. Methuselah finds Enoch, still walking with the angels, and he lays the whole trouble before him. The strange child, Lamech's terror, the suspicion that a watcher had fathered the boy, the whole knotted fear of it. And here, finally, the story lets the tension go. Because Enoch already knows. Enoch, living among the angels, party to the secrets of heaven, has seen what is coming and understands exactly what this child is. And his answer is reassurance. No, he tells Methuselah, go and tell your son the truth. This child is no watcher's son. He is Lamech's own son, true flesh and true blood, born of Lamech and Bitternosh, exactly as she swore. The oath was honest, the fear was wrong, and that light in the baby's eyes, that glow that filled the house and froze the father's heart, it is not a stain. It is not the mark of a fallen angel's child. It is a sign that this boy has been set apart for something. And Enoch gives the child his name. Call him Noah, he says. And he tells Methuselah what Noah is for. Because Enoch out there at the ends of the earth can see the shape of the future, and the future is dark. A flood is coming, he says, a great washing away. The earth has grown so corrupt, so full of violence and ruin, that it cannot be allowed to continue as it is. It is going to be cleansed, drowned, wiped clean down to the waterline. Everything that is has become so tangled with wickedness that the only remedy left is to end it and begin again. That is what Enoch has seen from his place among the angels. Not if, when. And this child, this glowing snow-white rose-red child with the sunrise in his eyes, this is the one who will come through it. He and his sons alone will survive the water. When everything else is swept away, Noah will be the seed left in the ground, the one from whom the whole world starts over. The glow was never a curse. The glow was hope. It was the light of the one small thing that was going to be saved when everything else was lost. And do you feel what just happened to the story? Everything inverts. For 2 whole movements we've been sitting inside dread, a father's cold fear, a monstrous suspicion, an accusation, an oath, a journey born of terror. We've been reading the glowing baby as something ominous. And now Enoch turns it over in his hands and shows us the other side, and it was radiant all along. Not a warning, a promise. The uncanny light in those eyes wasn't heaven's corruption leaking into a child. It was heaven's rescue, wrapped in swaddling, waiting in the dark for a flood no one else could see coming. It's a genuinely tender resolution. And if this were the whole story, you could fall asleep right here, comforted. The frightened father gets his answer. The child is his. The child is chosen. The child will live. But the answer plants a much larger seed of unease, and it's the seed the whole rest of this journey grows out of. Because Enoch doesn't just say a flood is coming. He says it's coming because of corruption. A corruption so total, so complete, so beyond any ordinary human wickedness, that the only cure left in all of heaven's judgment was to drown the entire world and grow it again from a single family. And you have to stop and ask, what does that even mean? What could possibly go so wrong on the earth that starting over from scratch is the merciful option? What was so broken that water was the only fix? We've had hints. The Watchers, the beings who came down, the children who were not quite children, the suspicion that Lamech's terror was reasonable in the first place, that in this world angels really had fathered sons on human women, and something had gotten loose that should never have gotten loose. Enoch's reassurance saves the baby, but it does not save the world. It confirms, almost in passing, that the world is already doomed, that the corruption is real and vast, and already here. And to understand that corruption, to understand what was actually walking the earth in the days this child was born, and why heaven decided the whole thing had to end, we have to go back. Back before the birth, back to a mountain, and to the night 200 of them looked down from the sky, and made a decision and came down. So let's go there, to the mountain and the 200, and the night it all began. The passage that tells this part of the story sits inside the Book of Enoch, in the Stretch Scholars label chapters 6 through 11. And here's the first strange thing about it, the thing that makes the detectives lean in close. This is supposed to be Enoch's book. His name is on the cover, so to speak. And yet, in these particular chapters, Enoch himself almost disappears. He's barely there. The story stops being about the man who walked with God and became something else entirely. A story about angels, about women, about a coming flood, about Noah. It reads, some scholars think, like a different book that has been quietly slipped inside this one. A seam you can feel with your fingers if you know where to press. And that seam is one of the reasons people came to suspect that a separate, older text, a Book of Noah, is hiding in here, wearing Enoch's clothes. But set the detective work aside for a moment. Just listen to the story it tells, because it is one of the strangest and most beautiful things in all of ancient literature. In the beginning of it, the text says, human beings had multiplied on the earth. There were more of them now, spreading out across the valleys and the river plains, and among them were daughters, beautiful ones, and there were watchers in the sky. That's the word the text uses. Watchers. Not simply angels, though that's what they are. The name itself tells you what they did. They watched. They were the ones assigned to look down on the world, to keep the long, patient vigil over the affairs of human beings, sleepless, tireless, faithful. Imagine that for a moment as you lie there in the dark. Beings whose entire purpose was to observe, to attend, to never look away. And for a long time the story implies that was all they did. They watched, and then they wanted. The text is very plain about it, almost quiet. The sons of heaven saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful and fair, and they desired them. That's it. That's the whole crack in the world, right there. Not a war in heaven, not a grand rebellion with banners. Just longing, just beings who were meant to watch, discovering that they no longer wanted only to watch. And here's the number the story insists on, the number that gives this section its weight: 200. The text says there were 200 of them. Not a vague host, not a countless multitude. 200. A specific, countable company of watchers who looked down at the world they were supposed to be guarding and made, together, a decision. Their leader, the one the text names first, is called Shemihaza. You'll also see it spelled Semjaza or Semyaza, depending on which manuscript and which translation you're reading. Because remember, this text survives complete only in that ancient Ethiopic Ge'ez, and comes to us through Aramaic scraps and later copies. So the names shimmer a little as they pass from tongue to tongue. Shemihaza, the chief of them. And beside him, or just behind him, a second name that is going to matter enormously before this story is done. Azazel. Hold on to that one, Azazel. Now here is a small human detail buried in this cosmic story, and it's the kind of thing that makes you realize how old and how thought through this text really is. Shemihaza, the leader, is afraid, not of God exactly. He's afraid of being left holding the blame alone. He says to the others, and I'm giving you the sense of it, not a quotation, he says, I fear that you will not really go through with this. I fear that I alone will have to pay the penalty for a great sin. He suspects his companions might lose their nerve and leave him exposed. So they swear an oath. That's the pivot of the whole thing. 200 of them standing together and to bind themselves to the plan, to make sure no one could back out and no one could be singled out. They take a mutual vow. They curse themselves together. They agree, all of them, to share whatever comes. It's a conspiracy in the oldest and most literal sense, a breathing together, a binding of many into one purpose, so that none can be pulled free. And in some readings of the story, that oath is woven right into the name of the place they choose, because the text tells you where they came down, not somewhere vague. A real mountain, one you can point to on a map today, Mount Hermon. It rises on what is now the border between Lebanon and Syria, snow on its peaks for much of the year, the tallest thing for a long way in every direction, the kind of mountain that feels, when you stand beneath it, like a threshold between the world below and the sky above. And that's exactly what the story makes it. The 200 descend onto the summit of Mount Hermon. And the text plays on the name Hermon, they say, because on it they swore the oath and bound themselves with the curse. Whether that's a real etymology or a poet's after-the-fact wordplay, scholars go back and forth. But you can see what the story is doing. It's marking the ground. This mountain, it says, is where it happened. This is the place where the watchers stopped watching and came down. And then they do the thing they came down to do. They take human wives. I want to be careful here, because the channel is a place to fall asleep, and this is not a story I want to make frightening or lurid. So let me tell it the way the text mostly tells it, plainly, almost tenderly, and with an enormous weight underneath. The watchers take the daughters of men as wives. They go among human beings, not as visitors, but as husbands. They build lives of a kind, and the horror of it, in the logic of the story, is not violence, not at first. The horror is simply that a line has been crossed that was never ever meant to be crossed. Two categories of being that were supposed to stay forever separate, the ones above and the ones below, the watchers and the watched, have been folded into each other. The boundary that held the world in its proper shape has been quietly, deliberately, irreversibly broken. And in this kind of ancient story, a broken boundary is the most dangerous thing there is. It doesn't stay in one place. It spreads. Now, if that were the whole of it, angels who came down and married women, you might almost read it as a sad love story. A trespass, yes, but a small and private one. And for a long time in the history of how people have read this text, that's the part everyone remembers. The forbidden marriages. The angels who fell for human beauty. But that is not what the story says, doomed the world. Because remember what these beings were, watchers, keepers of knowledge, attendants who had stood in the presence of things no human eye had ever seen, the workings of the heavens, the courses of the stars, the deep machinery underneath the surface of the world. They didn't come down empty-handed. They came down knowing things. And once they were here, once they were living among human beings as husbands and fathers and neighbours, they began, the text says, to teach. That's the turn. That's where this whole story stops being about desire and becomes about something much larger and much stranger. A question that will follow us all the way to the end of this video, and honestly, one that hasn't stopped following us to this very night. What happens when someone hands you knowledge you are not ready for? What happens when power arrives before wisdom does? Because the 200 did not only bring themselves down the mountain, they brought down what they knew, and what they knew was never meant to be ours. So let me tell you what they taught. It starts in the story with Azazel. Of all the 200, he is the one the text lingers on when it comes to teaching, the one whose lessons it describes in the most detail, the one it will eventually single out for the heaviest punishment. And what does Azazel teach? He teaches human beings how to work metal. Now on the surface that sounds almost gentle, almost useful. We think of metalworking as one of the great steps up out of the dark, the forge, the smith, the beautiful ordinary miracle of taking a lump of ore out of the ground and making it into a tool. But listen to what the text actually names, in what order. Azazel, it says, taught them to make swords, and knives, and shields, and breastplates. The very first fruits of this new knowledge in the telling of the story are the instruments of war, not the plough, not the cooking pot, the blade. Think about what that means inside the logic of the myth. Before this, in the world the story imagines, human beings could quarrel, could hurt each other with fists and stones, but there was a natural limit to the harm, a ceiling. And then a watcher comes down from the sky and shows them how to draw a hard, bright edge out of the earth itself, an edge that can end a life in a single motion, and the ceiling is gone. Violence has been given a technology. It has been given reach and speed and a terrible efficiency it never had before. The knowledge is not evil in itself. A sword is only shaped metal. But it is knowledge that changes what human beings are capable of, all at once, before anyone has learned how to carry it. That's the idea the story is circling. Power arriving faster than wisdom. And then the text does something you might not expect. It turns from the forge to the mirror, because Azazel, the same teacher in the same breath, is said to have taught something that sounds like the exact opposite of weapons of war. He taught the making of bracelets and ornaments. He showed women the use of antimony for the eyes, eye paint, what we'd call kohl or eyeliner. He taught the mixing of dyes to colour and to beautify. He taught, the story says, all the arts of adornment, mirrors and bracelets and paint and precious coloured stones. And here's the thing that makes this ancient and strange and worth turning over in the quiet of the night. Why would the same catalogue of forbidden knowledge put swords and eyeliner side by side? Why would a story about the doom of the world bother to condemn cosmetics? Because to the mind that wrote this, they belong together. They are two faces of the same coin, and the coin is this: knowledge that turns the human heart toward things it was not meant to want. The sword feeds the hunger to destroy. The ornament feeds the hunger to be desired, to compete, to display, to want, and to be wanted. Both of them take something simple and human and sharpen it into something that can wound. It's a remarkably subtle idea, honestly. For a text this old, the notion that vanity and violence spring from the same root, that the mirror and the blade are cousins. The story isn't saying beauty is a sin. It's saying that a certain kind of self-regard was let loose in the world, taught deliberately, by beings who should have known better, and that it too was a way of coming undone. And Azazel is only one teacher. The text has a whole roster. There are others among the 200, named in the manuscripts, each with his own dark specialty, and together they read almost like a curriculum of everything a person in the ancient world might fear and long for in equal measure. One of them teaches the cutting of roots, the deep knowledge of which plants heal and which plants kill, which leaves soothe a fever and which, ground fine, stop a heart. Another teaches enchantments, the casting of spells, the binding words that are supposed to bend the unseen world to a human will. Another teaches the loosing of spells, the counter-magic, how to undo what was bound. Sorcery, in other words, the whole art of trying to reach past the visible and take hold of the machinery underneath. And then, in some of the most haunting lines of the passage, there are the ones who look up. One watcher, the text says, teaches the courses of the moon. Another, the signs of the earth. Another, the knowledge of the clouds and the weather. And one teaches the stars, their secret paths, the way they turn and return, the hidden order of the sky. Astrology we'd call part of it, but it's bigger than that. It's the reading of the heavens themselves, the belief that the movements far above are a kind of writing, and that if you learn the script, you can read what is coming. The watchers who had stood in the sky and knew its workings from the inside hand that knowledge down, and the earth receives it. Now here is what I find genuinely remarkable about this list, and I want you to notice it too, drifting there in the dark. Look at what's on it. Metalworking, medicine, because that's what plant lore and root cutting really are. The shadow of medicine, the beginning of pharmacy. Astronomy, cosmetics, chemistry, in the dyes, writing some versions add. This is not a list of dark, useless, cursed things. This is a list of civilization. This is more or less the foundation of everything we have built. The story is telling you that the arts and sciences that lifted humanity up out of the animal world, the very knowledge we are most proud of, arrived in this telling as a transgression, as something stolen or smuggled or given by beings who had no right to give it before we were ready to hold it. That's the provocative idea, sitting at the very heart of the Book of the Watchers, and it's one of the oldest versions of a thought that has never left us. Knowledge itself as the original sin. Not this or that particular deed, knowing. The idea that there is such a thing as power that comes too early, wisdom handed to a people who have not yet grown the character to bear it, and that the handing down is itself the catastrophe. You can hear the echo of it in 100 stories since. The fire stolen from the gods, the apple from the tree. The bargain for forbidden understanding that always costs more than it seemed to. And you can hear it, if you're honest, in our own age too, every time some new and dazzling capability arrives in the world faster than anyone has figured out how to live with it. The story on the mountain is asking a question we are still asking tonight. Just because we can know a thing and do a thing, were we ever meant to? The text does not answer it kindly, because see what the world now holds. Weapons of war forged and sharpened in the hands of a people who a moment ago had only stones, sorcery loose in the villages, and poison lore in the arrogance of reading the stars, vanity spreading like a fever, and all of it taught deliberately by the 200 who came down. The knowledge alone would have been enough to tilt the world off its balance. But the knowledge is not alone, because remember why the Watchers came down in the first place. They came for the daughters of men, and they took them as wives, and now, while they are busy teaching swords and spells and the paths of the stars, those wives are bearing children. And the children of a union between the beings of the sky and the beings of the earth are not ordinary children. They are something the world has never seen and was never built to hold. So now you have the whole terrible recipe laid out. A people newly armed and newly proud and newly frightened, their hands full of powers they don't understand. And into that world, growing quietly at first, and then not quietly at all, come the offspring, the children of the Watchers, and it is the children more than the swords, more than the spells, who finally break the earth. The text calls them by a name you may have heard before, a name that has drifted down through thousands of years and still turns up in strange corners today. The Nephilim, the giants. They are the children of the Watchers and the daughters of men, and from the very beginning the story says there is something wrong with their scale. They are born and they grow, and they do not stop growing when a child should stop. They keep going. They rise up out of the villages that made them taller than the tallest man, and then taller than that, and then taller than anything a person could stand beside, and still feel like a person. The story reaches for numbers to describe it, and the numbers get so large they stop meaning anything, which is, I think, the point. The Nephilim are meant to be past comprehension, not monsters you could picture cleanly. Just a wrongness of size, a thing too big for the world, casting a shadow that falls across whole fields. And here is the quiet horror of it, told gently. Because it is not really horror at all. It's more like watching a slow tide come in. Something that large has to eat. That's where the story turns. At first, the text says, the giants simply consume. They eat everything the people can produce. Picture it the way the old text seems to want you to, a village, a season's harvest, grain gathered in against the winter, and one of these enormous children who needs all of it, and then needs more. The flocks, the herds, the stores, everything human hands had worked to grow and save, disappearing to feed a hunger that has no flaw to it. The people give, and it is never enough, because you cannot fill something built on a scale the world was never meant to sustain. And slowly the land itself begins to empty. The abundance runs out. The giants have eaten the world's surplus, and they are still hungry. And a hunger that large, when there is nothing left to feed it, does not simply go away. The text is spare about what comes next, and I'm going to be spare about it too, because you're here to fall asleep and there is no reason to dwell in the dark parts. So let me just say what the story says, softly. When the crops were gone, and the herds were gone, the giants turned. They turned on the creatures of the earth, and then, the text says, they turned on one another and on the people. Violence enters the world in a way it never had before, on a scale it never had before, and now you understand why Azazel's swords mattered, why the story bothered to name the blades. Because now the whole earth is armed and afraid, and preyed upon at once. The knowledge and the giants have met, and together they have made something the story can only describe as ruin. Destruction spreading outward, the world coming apart at a speed no one can stop. I want to keep this at the right distance, though the distance the story itself keeps, because this is not a horror movie, it's a myth, and myths hold their terrors far away, up on a high shelf, wrapped in old words, so you can look at them without being hurt. The suffering in this part of the tale is real inside the story, but it is told the way you might tell a child about a storm that happened long ago and far away, and is fully over now. It is not here, it is not tonight. It is a distant thundercloud on the horizon of a very old world, and you are watching it from a warm and quiet place, thousands of years downstream, safe. And that distance matters, because of what happens next, which is, to me, the most beautiful and the most human turn in the whole story. The earth cries out, not the people, the earth itself. The text imagines the ground, the land, the world as a living thing that can feel what is being done to it, and it makes a sound. The blood that has soaked into the soil, The ruin laid across the fields, the sheer weight of all that suffering, it rises. It becomes a cry, and the cry goes up, not sideways, not into the empty air, up, past the mountains, past the giants, past the clouds. The Watchers had taught men to read, all the way up to the gate of heaven. And in heaven, the story says, someone is still listening. Because, remember, not all the Watchers came down. 200 fell. But there were others who stayed, who kept the vigil they were made for, who never broke the oath because they never swore it. The faithful ones. And the text names 4 of them, the great archangels who stand in the presence of the highest heaven, Michael and Gabriel and Raphael, and one the manuscripts call Uriel, or in some lists Sariel. They are still at their posts, they are still watching the way Watchers are supposed to watch. And the cry of the ravaged earth reaches them. And they look down. I find this one of the most tender images in all of ancient literature, and I want to leave you sitting with it for a moment as the night settles around you. 4 beings of light standing at the threshold of heaven, looking down at a world they can see is being destroyed, the giants tearing across the land, the people crying out, the whole beautiful creation buckling under a weight it was never built to carry. And they cannot look away, that's the thing. They are watchers too, the true kind, and the whole meaning of a watcher is that you do not turn from what you see. They see it all, and they carry it. The story says, up to the very highest place, and they lay it down, and they ask the oldest question a good heart can ask when it looks at a suffering world. How long? How long is this allowed to go on? Will you really let it end this way? That question is the hinge of everything, because up to now you might have wondered why the flood ever had to come. It's a hard thing, a drowned world, and the older sections of this very story wrestle with it. Remember Enoch, reassuring the frightened family that a flood is coming, and the terrible weight of that reassurance. But here, in the Book of the Watchers, you finally see the machinery underneath it. The flood is not a whim, it is not cruelty. In the logic of the story, it is the answer to a cry. The earth has been so thoroughly broken, the boundary trespassed, the forbidden knowledge loosed, the giants devouring everything, violence with no flaw and no end, that the corruption has become total. There is nothing left to save by mending, and the faithful watchers, the ones who never fell, carry the evidence of that up to heaven and force the question into the open. Once that cry has been heard, once it has been laid before the throne, judgment stops being a choice. It becomes the only mercy left, the only way to make the crying stop. And so, high above the ruined world, in the story, a decision begins to form. The same shape of decision the 200 made on the mountain, but running now in the opposite direction. They came down to break the world, and heaven, hearing the world break, begins to move to wash it clean, which is where the water comes in, and where at last a certain glowing child born to a frightened man named Lamech turns out to matter more than anyone could have guessed, because when the whole earth is scheduled to end, the survival of one family becomes the thread on which everything hangs. But before the water rises, the archangels have work to do. Because you don't only end a flood by drowning the world, you have to deal with the ones who started it, the 200 and their leader in darkness, and the great teacher of swords. And what heaven does with them is the strangest turn yet, and it leaves something behind in the world that outlives the flood entirely. We'll go there next, so let's go there, gently, the way we've gone everywhere else, from a warm and quiet place, thousands of years downstream, watching an old world end without any of it being able to touch you tonight. The story says, heaven does not send the flood first. Heaven sends messengers first. The 4 who were still standing at the threshold, the ones who carried the cry upward, are now given something to carry back down. Each of them, the text says, is handed a task. And it's worth slowing down here, because this is not one blunt act of destruction. It's careful, It's almost administrative in a strange and ancient way, a list of assignments, each angel sent to undo one specific thread of the ruin, as if the world were a knot that had to be untied in a particular order, or it would only pull tighter. To one of them, the story gives the task of going to Noah, of warning him, of telling him quietly that the end is coming, and that he must hide, that a remnant must be preserved, that the thread of living things must not be cut all the way through. And here you feel the two halves of this whole tale reach for each other across the centuries. The glowing child from the beginning of our story, the one Lamech feared and Enoch blessed, is now the single point of light that heaven means to protect while it puts out all the rest. The warning that saves Noah is, in the logic of the story, part of the same act that drowns the world. Mercy and judgment arriving in the same breath. To another is given the task of the giants. And the way the text handles the giants is one of the quietest, eeriest turns in the whole account, so let me tell it softly. Heaven does not, in this telling, simply strike them down from above. The messenger is sent to set the giants against one another, to turn that terrible strength inward. The children of the Watchers who had grown past all scale and devoured the world, and then turned on the people, now they turn on each other, the story says, and destroy themselves with the very violence they had brought into being. There is something almost unbearably fitting in it. The weapons Azazel taught, the appetite that had no flaw, the ruin they had spread outward across the fields, all of it collapses back in on the ones who made it. They are undone by exactly what they were, and to Raphael, this is the part I most wanted to reach, is given the leader in darkness. Azazel, the great teacher of swords, the one who handed humanity the knife and the mirror, the maker of weapons and vanity both. The story does not have Raphael kill him. It has him bind him, and the images the old text reaches for here are so vivid and so strange that they've stayed lodged in people's imaginations for 2,000 years. Raphael is told to bind Azazel hand and foot and to cast him into the darkness. To open a place in the desert, the text gives it a name, Dudale, a word scholars still turn over, uncertain exactly where or what it means, and to throw him into it, and to lay rough and jagged rocks upon him, and to cover him over so that he cannot see the light. And there he is to stay, not destroyed, held, sealed in the dark beneath the stones, the text says, until a distant and final day, the great day of judgment far off at the end of everything, when he will be led out at last to answer for what he loosed on the world. Sit with that for a moment, because it is such a haunting idea to fall asleep on. The one who taught the world to make weapons is not annihilated. He is buried alive in the dark, bound under stones in a hidden place, waiting through the flood, through all the ages of history, through every century between that world and this one, for a reckoning that has not yet come. In the frame of the story he is still there, still waiting, the teacher of swords, sealed under the desert, and the sentence not yet carried out. And then, with the giants turning on each other, and the leaders bound in the dark, the water comes. The flood the whole story has been leaning toward, the one Enoch foretold to the frightened family, the cleansing that could no longer be avoided. It rises and it covers everything, and it washes the ruined world away. The corruption that had become total is answered by a mercy that is also total. Everything is unmade. The slate is wiped in the oldest sense of that phrase, scoured back to nothing, so that the world can begin again clean. That's the reset. That's the great washing that sits at the centre of so many of the world's oldest stories. And if the tale ended there, it would be a hard, clean thing, terrible, but finished. The world broke, the world was drowned, the world begins again. But here is the hinge, here is the single turn that makes the whole Book of Noah necessary. The reason this entire tradition exists, and it's a detail so small and so strange that it's easy to miss, and once you've seen it you can't unsee it. The giants died. Their enormous bodies died in the water, and in the war they turned on themselves. But the giants were never only bodies. Remember what they were, the children of two worlds, half of the earth and half of something that came down from the sky. Their flesh came from their human mothers, but something else in them, the story says, came from the Watchers, from the beings of spirit who fathered them. And when the flesh died, that other half did not. The bodies drowned. The spirits did not. That's the idea the text plants here so quietly, and it is one of the most consequential single sentences in all of this ancient literature. When the giants' bodies perished in the flood, their spirits were left behind, loosed, homeless, neither fully of heaven nor fully of earth, belonging to no place, unable to die, because part of them was never mortal to begin with, and unable to rest, because the flesh that had housed them was gone. The story imagines them drifting across the drowned and drying world, invisible, restless, with nowhere to go and nothing to be. And this is the origin the old text is reaching for. These, it says, are the unclean spirits, the demons, not a separate creation, not a rival race made in the dark, just the leftover half of the giants, the part the flood could not drown, wandering a scoured world looking for somewhere to belong. The evil that walks the earth in this telling is not something new. It's a remnant, a residue of the old broken world, strained out of the flood and left standing on the far bank when the water finally went down. So the reset was not perfectly clean. That's the thing to carry into the dark tonight. Heaven had bound the leader under the stones and turned the giants against themselves and washed the whole corrupt world away in the flood. And still, when the water receded and the ground dried and the survivors climbed down onto a new and empty earth, something invisible had come across with them, something the flood could not touch, because you cannot drown a thing that has no body. It was already there, waiting, in the air of the clean new world. And the survivors did not know it yet. Noah and his sons, and the small remnant of living things, they step out onto a washed and silent earth, believing the old world is entirely behind them, drowned and gone. They have no idea that the worst of it had learned to travel without a body, that it had crossed the water, that it was already waiting for their children, which is exactly where a second ancient book picks up the story, and where the Book of Noah at last begins to take its true shape. Because the Book of the Watchers, the part of Enoch we've been living inside, mostly stops at the flood. It gives you the descent, the oath, the forbidden knowledge, the giants, the binding, the water. It gives you the spirits left behind, and then it lets them drift off into the story's edges and doesn't fully follow them. To find out what those homeless spirits actually did on the far side of the water, you have to open a different book. That book is called Jubilees, and it's another one of these strange survivors. So let me set it beside you for a moment before we go in. Jubilees is a separate ancient retelling of the same early history, Genesis and the beginning of Exodus told again in more detail, with more of the hidden machinery showing. Like Enoch, it did not stay in the standard canon. Like Enoch, it survives complete only in Gehazi, kept as scripture by the same Ethiopian Orthodox tradition that preserved the Book of the Watchers when almost everyone else let it go. Two banned books, two ghosts, kept alive in the same quiet corner of the world for 2,000 years, and it's in the 10th chapter of this second one that the demons finally step forward into the light of the story, because in Jubilees the flood is not the end of the trouble. It's an intermission. The waters recede, the world dries, Noah's family comes down onto the clean earth and begins to do the thing the whole flood was meant to allow. They begin again. Children are born, then grandchildren. The line of the survivors spreads out across the emptied world, small and hopeful, the way a family fills a house after a long grief. And for a while, it seems, the old world really is gone. And then the spirits find them. The story says the unclean spirits, the leftover half of the dead giants, the part the flood could not drown, begin to gather around the children and grandchildren of Noah. And they are not idle. They begin to lead them astray, to pull them toward ruin, toward the old corruptions, toward the very things that had broken the world the first time. And worse, in a way that would have felt very close and very real to the people who first told this tale, the spirits begin to make them sick, to afflict them. The story imagines these homeless, restless things settling over the young families of the New World like an illness, causing disease, causing madness, causing the children to sicken and stray and die. The old world's poison, seeping up through the clean new ground. And now the text gives them a leader. Because of course it does. A scattered swarm is frightening, but a swarm with a will behind it is a story. The chief of these spirits is given a name, and it's a name worth knowing because it will echo through a great deal of later tradition. Mastema. In the old language, the word carries the sense of hostility, of accusation, of enmity itself, a name that is almost a description. The prince of the leftover spirits, the one who speaks for all the homeless things the flood left standing on the earth. And here the story turns to Noah, and it shows you something I find unexpectedly moving. Because Noah, in Jubilees, is no longer the man in the ark. That's behind him now. He is old. He has survived the end of one whole world, carried his family across the water, and stepped down onto the new earth, believing the horror was finished. And now he is standing in his own long old age, watching the same darkness he thought he'd left behind come creeping back up through his grandchildren. Watching the little ones sicken, watching his descendants be led astray by something he cannot see and cannot fight. Imagine surviving the flood, surviving the literal end of the world, and then, as an old man, having to watch the thing you survived reach out of the past and lay its hand on your grandchildren. That's where Noah is when this chapter finds him. And so he does the only thing left to him. He prays. The text has him go to God directly, plainly, the way a grieving grandfather might. He describes what the spirits are doing to his children's children, leading them astray, destroying them, making them sick, and he asks simply for them to be bound, shut away, sealed off from his family, the way Azazel was sealed under the stones, so that the remnant of the old world cannot go on poisoning the new one. It's a small human prayer inside a cosmic story, not asking for power, not asking for knowledge, just an old man asking that the thing which crossed the water be kept away from the people he loves. And here is where the story does something that has puzzled and unsettled readers for a very long time, because heaven's answer is not a clean yes. The story says God hears Noah and moves to bind the spirits. The command goes out for the unclean spirits to be gathered up and shut away, all of them, sealed off from the earth so they can no longer afflict the living. And that would be the tidy ending. The loose thread from the flood finally knotted off, the old world's residue locked away for good. But then Mastema steps forward. The chief of the spirits comes before heaven and makes a request of his own. He argues, and the argument itself is the strange part, that if every last one of the spirits is bound, he will have nothing left to work with. No power to exercise, no dominion over the sons of men, none of the role he claims the corrupted world has left him. He asks that some of them be allowed to remain, and the story says the request is in part granted. Not all of the spirits are bound. A portion is left free. The text puts a number on it, and the number is what people remember, a tenth. 9 parts out of 10 are shut away in the place of judgment, sealed off from the earth. But 1 part in 10 is permitted to stay, to remain on the ground, to go on doing in a smaller and permitted way what the whole swarm had been doing before. Sit with how strange that is, and how honest. Noah asks for the darkness to be taken away entirely, and heaven answers by taking away most of it, 90%, and leaving the last 10th loose in the world on purpose. The flood did not fully end the old world. The binding did not fully end the old world. Even the mercy has a remainder built into it, a residue of the residue, a tithe of the drowned world's ghosts left walking the new one by explicit permission. And whatever you make of that, and people have made a great deal of it, across a great many centuries, you can feel why the story needed it. Because the people first telling this tale looked around at their own world and saw exactly this. A world that had, by every account, already been cleansed once. A world that was supposed to be starting over clean. And yet a world still full of sickness, still full of straying, still full of an unseen, something that pulled at people and made the children ill. The 10th is the story's way of explaining the world you actually live in, a world after the great washing that is somehow still not washed all the way clean. So the survivors don't get the ending they hoped for. They don't get a spotless earth. What they get is a compromise, a world mostly cleared, with a permitted shadow left in it, and the knowledge that the old broken world would never entirely be gone. They would have to learn to live with the remnant, to survive not just the flood, but what the flood left behind, which raises the only question that matters next, the practical, aching human question. If a 10th of it is allowed to stay, if the sickness is going to keep coming, then how exactly is Noah's family supposed to survive it? And the answer to that is where the Book of Noah finally becomes itself. Because the same chapter that tells you a 10th of the darkness was allowed to stay does not leave you there. It doesn't hand Noah the sickness and walk away. In the very same breath, the story gives him something to answer it with, and what it gives him is, of all things, medicine. The text says that when the spirits were bound and the 10th left loose, heaven did not abandon the survivors to it. One of the angels is sent, in some tellings the same healing messenger who bound the darkness in the first place, and the angel comes to Noah as a teacher. And what he teaches is exactly the thing the new world needs. He teaches Noah how to heal, how to recognize the diseases the spirits cause, and how to answer each of them. And the medicine, the story says, is drawn from the earth itself, from the herbs, from the plants and roots and growing things of the washed and quiet world. The remedy for the old world's poison is planted all along in the soil of the new one, and heaven simply shows Noah where to look, and which leaf answers which affliction, and how to draw the healing out of the ground. I want you to feel the shape of what just happened, because it is one of the most beautiful turns in the whole tradition, and it is easy to walk right past it. Remember, all the way back, what the Watchers taught. Remember the list of forbidden things, the swords and the mirrors, the spellcraft, and the reading of the stars. And remember one item on that list that seemed small and strange at the time, the cutting of roots, the lore of plants, the knowledge of which growing thing does what, which leaf heals and which leaf harms, handed down to humanity in the dark, as one of the things people were never meant to be given, a shadow version of medicine leaked out of heaven without permission. And now, on the far side of the flood, that very same knowledge comes back. The plants, the roots, the healing hidden in the green things of the earth. But this time it does not come stolen, whispered down a mountain by a fallen angel in the night. This time it comes openly given, taught by a faithful messenger in daylight to a good old man, for the express purpose of undoing harm. The forbidden thing returns redeemed. The same knowledge that helped break the world is handed back, cleaned, to help mend it. The root cutting that was a crime in the old world becomes a mercy in the new one. And I don't think the people who told this story could have drawn that circle by accident. It's too perfect. The wound and the cure are made of the same thing. They always were. What made all the difference was who gave it, and why, and whether it was given in the open or stolen in the dark. But it's what Noah does next that finally, quietly brings this whole long journey home. Because Noah does not just learn the medicine and use it and let it die with him. The story says he writes it down. He takes the knowledge the angel gave him, every remedy, every herb, every way of answering the afflictions the 10th would go on causing, and he sets it into a book. He makes a record. An old man on a new earth, carefully writing down how to survive the thing the old world left behind, so that it will not have to be relearned from suffering by every generation that comes after him. And then, this is the detail that matters most, the one scholars point to as one of the clearest, most solid threads in the whole reconstruction. He gives that book to his son, to Shem. The knowledge passes from Noah's hands into Shem's one generation to the next. A book handed across a table from a father who survived the end of the world to a son who will have to live in what comes after it. And there it is. That, at last, is the Book of Noah beginning to come into focus. Not as a legend, not as a rumour, but as a described object inside an ancient text. A book written by Noah, filled with the healing of diseases and the binding of the spirits that cause them, given by hand to Shem. A medical book, an anti-demonic book, a survival manual for a world that had been washed clean but not clean enough. When scholars talk about the lost Book of Noah, this is one of the truest strands of it, this book of herbs and healing and the holding back of the dark, passed down through the line of the survivors. And do you see what it makes Noah in this telling? We remember him for the animals, 2 by 2, the great wooden boat, the remnant of living things carried across the water. That's the image everyone keeps. But the story we've been following says he carried something else across the flood too. He carried knowledge. He was the keeper of everything from before, the memory of the old world, the medicine to survive what it left behind, the wisdom of Enoch that had been passed down his own family line. All of it gathered up and brought over the water in a mind and then set down in a book. Noah as the bridge, the one man who stood in both worlds, who remembered the world that drowned and lived to write for the world that rose, and made sure the crossing was not only of bodies, but of understanding. The last librarian of the world before the flood. And that is the thread that ties this entire strange story together, from the glowing child all the way here. Because think about what the Book of Noah in this telling actually is. It is a book about how to survive what the old world left behind. A book made precisely because the reset was not clean, because 1/10 of the darkness had been allowed to stay, and the survivors needed a way to live alongside it. It is knowledge written down and handed on, father to son, specifically so that it would not be lost. And then, and here is the ache at the centre of all of this, the quiet irony we've been circling from the very first night of this story, the book itself was lost anyway. The one thing it was written to prevent. A book made to carry knowledge safely across the generations, so that hard-won wisdom would never have to vanish and be learned again from pain, and it did not survive as itself. It slipped out of the canon. It stopped being copied whole. It broke apart, and its pieces drifted down into other people's scriptures, into Enoch and into Jubilees, into a few brittle fragments in desert caves, until the book about not losing knowledge had, itself, been almost entirely lost. Passed hand to hand, Noah to Shem, on and on down the long dark of the centuries, and then somewhere in that dark, set down and never fully picked up again, which leaves us thousands of years later in exactly the position the book was written to prevent, standing over the scattered pieces of something that was supposed to be kept whole, trying to gather it back up, and that, the strange, patient, almost impossible work of reassembling a book that was meant never to be lost, is where the scholars come in, where the detective story we glimpsed at the very beginning finally begins in earnest. Because a handful of people in the last century or so looked at all these scattered fragments and dared to ask whether they could be fitted back together, whether the ghost had a shape. And that is where we're going next, so picture the scholar. Not a torch-bearing adventurer in a tomb, but someone bent over a desk, under a lamp, with a magnifying glass, and a photograph of a scrap of leather no bigger than a playing card. That is where this ghost gets chased, not in the sand, but in the seams. Because the strange thing about the story you just heard, the glowing child, the watchers, the giants, the flood, the demons, the book of healing, is that it doesn't sit still inside the books that carry it. It bulges, it repeats, it contradicts the pages around it. And to a certain kind of careful reader, those little wrongnesses are not flaws to be smoothed over. They're fingerprints. They're the marks left behind when someone, long ago, took an older book and stitched it into a newer one. Here's the thing about how these readers work. The join almost always shows if you know how to look for it, and in ancient texts it shows in odd little ways. A story that keeps calling its hero by name, and then, for one long stretch, forgets him entirely. A passage that suddenly cares about details nothing around it cares about. A voice that shifts mid-chapter into a different key. Scholars call these things seams, and they had noticed for a long time that the Book of Enoch was full of them, especially in two places. Right at the start, in the chapters about the Watchers and the Flood, the ones that, as you heard, barely mention Enoch at all, and can't stop talking about Noah. And right at the end in the story of that shining newborn which reads almost like a self-contained little tale someone dropped in. And in the middle of the last century, a scholar named Joseph Milik, usually written J.T. Milik, looked at all of that and made a bold proposal. Milik was one of the people who worked most closely with the Dead Sea Scrolls in their earliest, most secretive years, one of the small handful of men who first handled those Aramaic fragments and tried to read them. And what he suggested was this, that those seam-heavy passages inside Enoch, the Watcher chapters, and the story of Noah's birth weren't originally written for Enoch's book at all, that they came from somewhere else, from an older, separate, independent book, written in Aramaic, a Book of Noah. Not a vague tradition floating in the air, but an actual text, with an actual shape that had been quarried for parts, its best pieces set into Enoch like stones taken from an older wall and built into a newer house. And Milik didn't stop with Enoch. Among the scrolls found in the caves near Qumran, there was a small damaged fragment given the label 1Q19, and someone, looking at its contents, its overlaps with the Noah material, actually labelled it, tentatively, a Book of Noah. A scrap. A few broken lines, but a scrap that seemed to belong to the same lost thing. So Milik's picture was of a book that had left pieces of itself in at least 3 places at once. Buried in the front of Enoch, buried in the back of Enoch, and surfacing on its own in the dust of a cave by the Dead Sea. 3 echoes of one vanished voice. And then there are the fragments that make the hair on your arms stand up a little even now. Among the scrolls are 3 related texts, catalogued with the labels 4Q534, 4Q535, and 4Q536. Scholars have given them names that sound like they belong in a very different kind of story. The birth of Noah, the elect of God, and when you read what survives of them, and it isn't much, it's torn and gapped and maddening, you find a description of a child. A chosen child, a child born with signs on his body, with special marks that are read like a language, like the child himself is a message written in flesh. A child who will grow into secret knowledge, who will know things others don't, whose coming is somehow foretold in the very shape of him. These fragments were painstakingly edited and published in a full scholarly edition by Emile Pouek in 2001, and I want to be honest with you about them, because the honesty is the whole point here. It is debated whether that child is Noah. The texts are broken. The name isn't simply sitting there on an unbroken line saying, "This is Noah." Some scholars are fairly convinced, others are cautious. But the resonance is uncanny. A wondrous, marked, chosen infant glowing in the record of a people who kept the story of a wondrous, marked, chosen infant named Noah. And here's the detail that turns the whole thing from guesswork into something with real weight. Because you might be thinking, this is all inference, all reading between the lines. Did anyone back then ever actually say out loud that there was such a book? And the answer is yes. The Book of Noah is named outright, by title, inside other ancient texts. The Book of Jubilees, the retelling you already met, the one that carried the demons past the flood and gave Noah his medicine, refers to Noah writing everything down in a book, and speaks of that writing as a real thing, handed down. And another ancient work, the Aramaic Levi document, also gestures back to a Book of Noah as a known source, something a reader was simply expected to have heard of. Think about what that means. It means the Book of Noah wasn't only a modern scholar's clever reconstruction from seams and scraps. It was a title that ancient writers dropped into their own pages, the way you might mention a book you assume everyone has read. A book everyone once knew, and no one in the end kept. That's the shape of the case. Seams inside Enoch that don't fit. A fragment in a cave labelled with Noah's name. A trio of scrolls about a marked and chosen child. And, threaded through it all, other books referring to a Book of Noah as though it plainly existed. Lay those side by side, and it's hard not to feel the outline of something real pressing up through the surface. A book that was, and then wasn't, dismantled for parts, its title surviving even after its body was gone. But I promised you honesty, and here is where I have to slow down and be scrupulous, because this is exactly the place where a story like this wants to run ahead of what anyone can actually prove. This is a reconstruction. It is not a certainty. We do not have the Book of Noah. Nobody has ever held it, opened it, read it, cover to cover. What we have are the fragments, the seams, the mentions, and a very reasonable, very careful hypothesis about how they might all connect. And plenty of serious, honest scholars look at the very same evidence and come to a gentler conclusion. They wonder whether there was ever really one single, unified Book of Noah at all, one book with a beginning and an end, or whether what we're seeing is something looser and more human. A cluster, a swirl of Noah traditions, stories about the flood survivor and his strange birth and his secret medicine, that floated around the ancient world in many forms, getting written down here and quoted there and named somewhere else, without ever having been bound into one authoritative volume. On that reading, the book we keep reaching for might be less a lost object and more a lost atmosphere, a gravity, a shape that many texts orbited without any of them being the thing itself. And I find I don't mind that we can't decide, because that uncertainty is the truest part of the whole story. We are, quite literally, chasing a ghost, and a ghost, by its nature, is something you can sense the presence of without ever being able to grip. Honest people, careful people, people who have given their whole lives to these brittle scraps of Aramaic, stand over the same evidence and disagree gently about its shape, whether it was one book or 100 stories, whether the child in the cave fragments is Noah or someone else, whether the seams in Enoch are one lost source or several. None of them can be certain. All of them are looking at the same faint outline in the dark, trying to name what it was. And so are you now, lying there in the quiet, reaching with them toward a book that may or may not have ever been a single thing, and feeling, all the same, how much is there? So let's follow the ghost the other way for a moment. Not toward how scholars are putting it back together, but backward toward how it came apart in the first place. Because a book doesn't usually vanish all at once, in a single fire, on a single night. More often it dissolves. Slowly, quietly, the way sugar disappears into water, still there in a sense, but no longer something you can lift out and hold. And when you trace the disappearance of the Book of Noah, you're really watching a story get taken apart in stages, dismembered so gently that no one, at the time, would have called it destruction at all. The first stage you already know, even if you didn't think of it that way. The book was absorbed, its best pieces, the radiant birth, the watchers, the flood, the demons and their binding, the medicine written down and handed to Shem, were lifted out and set into other books, into Enoch, into Jubilees, into the Genesis Apocryphon, that vivid Aramaic retelling where Lamech confronts his wife in the dark. And at first, this doesn't look like loss at all. It looks like the opposite. It looks like preservation. The story is being copied, retold, loved enough to be carried into new containers. But there's a hidden cost, and it's the same cost you pay when you pour one liquid into 3 different cups. The original vessel is now empty. The book, as a book, no longer needs to exist, because everything worth keeping in it is somewhere else now, scattered, mixed, no longer its own. It has been honoured to death, quoted out of existence. And then comes the second stage, the one with the real finality to it, because those containers, the books that had swallowed the Noah material and kept it safe, were themselves pushed out. You've heard how it went for Enoch, marginalised, set outside the fence of Scripture, until by around the 4th century it was simply no longer part of the book that most of the world would go on to read. Jubilees went the same way, kept as Scripture only in that one faithful corner of the world, in the Ethiopian church, and set aside almost everywhere else. The Genesis Apocryphon didn't even manage that. It slept in a cave by the Dead Sea for something like 2,000 years, unread by anyone, until the 20th century pulled it back into the light. So look at what that means for our lost book. Its pieces were saved by being poured into other vessels, and then those vessels were themselves carried out of the house. The Book of Noah didn't just fall through one crack. It fell through a crack into a room, and then that whole room was quietly closed off and forgotten. And what was left in the great book that everyone did keep? What survived the double vanishing, out in the open, in the Bible itself? A whisper. 4 verses. If you open Genesis chapter 6 and read the very first lines before the rains ever begin, you'll find them, and if you weren't looking, you'd slide right past them without a second thought. That when human beings began to multiply on the earth, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. That there were Nephilim on the earth in those days and also afterward. That these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And then it's over. The text simply moves on, to the rain, to the ark, to the animals, as though nothing strange has just been said. 4 verses. That's all. That is what remains in the open of everything you've spent this long night inside. The 200 angels, the mountain, the oath, the forbidden knowledge, the giants devouring the world, the demons that crossed the water, the glowing child, the healing book. All of it in the canon, compressed down to a handful of cryptic lines that raise 1,000 questions and answer none of them. And once you know the size of the thing behind it, those 4 verses change. They stop reading like the whole story and start reading like the tip of something enormous. Like a single stone poking out of a field that turns out, when you dig, to be the top of a buried wall a mile long. The mighty men of old, men of renown, it's such a small, quiet phrase. But now you can hear the giants inside it. The sons of God who took wives, 4 ordinary words, and behind them the whole vast, terrible, tender story of the Watchers and what they broke. The canon didn't erase the tale completely. It kept a door. A tiny door cracked open just enough to let a draught through. And then it let the rest of the house fall down. And here is the question that keeps you awake, or would if you weren't so pleasantly close to sleep. Why? Why keep the whisper and let the book go? Because that's a choice, isn't it? Even a slow, unspoken, generations-long choice is still a kind of decision. A tradition looked at this enormous story and somewhere along the way decided it belonged mostly on the outside. And I want to hold the possible reasons very lightly here, the way you'd hold something fragile, because nobody left us a note explaining it, and anyone who tells you they know for certain is telling you more than the evidence allows. But you can imagine the discomforts. There's the sheer strangeness of angels desiring women and fathering children, a picture of the heavenly world as something that could reach down and breed with the earth, that could blur the line between the human and the divine until you couldn't quite say where one ended and the other began, for a faith moving toward a single, sovereign, holy other God, a sky that crowded with beings who could fall and lust and teach and be bound, that might have simply felt like too much, too populous, too near to the older stories of gods behaving like people, the very thing the tradition was trying to leave behind. And there's the matter of the knowledge. This is a story in which learning itself, metalwork, medicine, the reading of the stars, arrives as a transgression smuggled down by rebels. That's a heavy double-edged idea, and maybe a dangerous one to keep at the centre of your scripture. And there's the plain unruliness of it, a story this wild, this detailed, this full of names and giants and glowing infants, is hard to contain. Perhaps it was easier in the end to keep the whisper clean, brief, unexplained, and let the sprawling, uncomfortable, magnificent rest of it drift out to the edges, held lightly. We can't know. We can only notice the shape of what was chosen. And that's the thing I keep turning over, lying here in the dark thinking about it. What happens when a civilization edits its own memory? Because that's what this is, in the gentlest possible sense. Not a conspiracy, not a burning, just the slow, cumulative decisions of many people over many centuries about what was worth copying one more time, and what could be allowed to fade. And an enormous amount was allowed to fade. A whole cosmology. A whole explanation for why the world is the way it is, where sickness comes from, where knowledge comes from, why the flood was necessary, what got left behind on the far side of it. Reduced to 4 verses and a draft through a cracked door. But here's the part that steadies me, the part that turns the loss back toward wonder. It didn't work. Not entirely. You can pour a book into other books and carry those books out of the house, and still the story stays. It survived in Ge'ez, in a faithful church at the edge of the map. It survived in the dark of a cave wrapped in leather, waiting 2,000 years for someone to come and unroll it. It survived as a title dropped in other people's pages. It survived as seams, as scraps, as a marked and chosen child, glowing faintly in a fragment too broken to name him. You can decide to forget a thing, but a story that has once been that alive doesn't fully agree to be forgotten. It goes underground. It waits in the cracks, and it leaves its mark on everything around it, so that even the 4 verses that stayed behind still hum quietly with the sighs of what was taken away. So let's gather it all up, softly, one last time, the way you'd gather the pieces of a dream before you let it go. Because we've come a long way tonight, you and I, and it's worth holding the whole thing in your mind for a moment before you set it down. It began with a child, a newborn so strange his own father was afraid, a body white as snow and red as a rose, hair like wool, and eyes that opened and filled the whole house with light, as if the sun had come to live indoors. And you remember how the fear travelled up the family line, from Lamech to Methuselah, all the way to Enoch at the ends of the earth, until the answer came back down the mountain that the glow was not a curse, but a sign. This child would live. This child would carry a family across the end of the world. And you remember why the world had to end? The 200 watchers on the peak of the mountain, and their oath, and the line they crossed that was never meant to be crossed. The knowledge they handed down, the swords and the mirrors, the star courses and the cutting of roots, powers let loose before anyone was ready to hold them. The giants who grew out of all that, and ate the earth bare, and turned on everything until the ground itself cried out, and the cry reached heaven. The flood that answered, and that one quiet, chilling detail that wouldn't wash clean, that when the giants' great bodies died, something of them stayed. Spirits with no home drifting on the far side of the water waiting for the survivors. And you remember the mercy folded into it, the aged Noah praying over his afflicted children, the angels teaching him, in return, how to heal, how the same plants the rebels had twisted into dark arts could be turned back toward mending, given openly this time from above, and Noah writing it down. A book of healing pressed into the hands of his son, so that the knowledge of how to survive what the old world left behind would not be lost. And then the strangest turn of all, that the book about not losing knowledge was itself lost, poured into Enoch, into Jubilees, into a scroll that slept in a cave, and then carried out to the edges of memory until all that remained in the open was a whisper of 4 verses. And the patient people in our own time bent over their lamps and their fragments, still trying to gather the pieces of it, chasing the ghost, disagreeing honestly about its shape, whether it was ever one book at all, or only the echo of a story too big for any single vessel to hold. And that is the quiet wonder I'd like to leave you with as you drift, that a book can be erased and still refuse to fully disappear, that you can take a thing apart and pour it out and close the door on it, and still it leaves its shape behind, pressed into everything around it, like a fossil. Not the creature itself, the creature is long gone, but the exact impression of it in the stone, every rib and ridge, so clear you can read the shape of a life that ended before there were people to see it. That's what the Book of Noah is now. A fossil, a hollow in the rock, in the precise shape of the thing that's missing. And you can trace its outline with your finger, even in the dark, even now. Think of how much had to happen for even that hollow to survive. A church at the edge of the map, copying and recopying a forbidden book in an old language for century after century, long after the rest of the world had let it go, never knowing they were keeping a door open for us. A cave above a dead sea and dry air and a jar, and the sheer luck of 2,000 years of nobody finding it, until one ordinary day someone did. A title dropped almost carelessly into another writer's page. That turned out to be a thread you could follow all the way back. It shouldn't have lasted. By every reasonable measure, the Book of Noah should be nothing now, not even a rumour. And instead, its outline is clear enough that people can argue about it. That's not erasure. That's the strangest kind of survival there is. And maybe that's the gentlest thought to carry down with you. That the things which matter have a way of leaving marks. That a story told well enough and loved hard enough sinks into the ground it grew in and keeps its shape there, patient, waiting, for as long as it takes. The people who first told this one are gone. The book they told it in is gone. And yet here it is, tonight, in your room, filling the quiet, the child, the mountain, the flood, the healing, passed all the way down to you across more years than you can really picture, and still warm. There's something so gentle in that when you sit with it, that nothing truly loved is ever cleanly lost, that thousands of years after someone somewhere decided this story could be allowed to fade, here we are, you, half asleep in your bed, and me, and a handful of scholars under their lamps, still reassembling what someone once tried to forget, still reaching toward it. The forgetting didn't win. It never quite does. And if this kept you company tonight, if it filled the quiet and carried you gently towards sleep, I'd love it if you'd leave a like before you go. It's a small thing, but it helps these journeys find the next person lying awake in the dark. And subscribe if you'd like more of them, more lost books, more forbidden histories, more of these long, soft walks through the things the world set down and almost forgot. And here's my favourite part, the thing I always ask. Down in the comments, tell me where in the world you are and what time it is where you're lying right now. I read them, and it's the loveliest feeling, someone in a city just waking up, someone else with the whole night ahead, a whole sleeping planet of us, scattered across every hour at once, all here in the same quiet place together. Tell me your corner of it, and now let go. There's nothing left to hold. The flood is far behind him now, The waters have long since pulled back off the hills, and the world is washed and new and steaming faintly in a young sun. The survivor stands on solid ground, an old man with a book in his hands, the knowledge carried across the deep, safe and given away and kept. Everything that needed saving has been saved, and you don't have to carry any of it. Not the giants, not the demons, not the ghost. The scholars are still gently chasing. All of that can wait in the fossil stone until some other night. For now there's only the dark soft around you, and your breath slowing, and the warm certainty that the story is finished and the world came out the other side. You're safe here, the book is closed, and you can sleep now. Rest well.